Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Joe and I'm the dad.
And I'm Raya and I'm the daughter.
Hey, I want to remind you, if you get an email and the subject says knock knock,
Yeah?
don't open it.
Why?
It's Jehovah's Witnesses working from home. We're going to be talking about Genesis here. Genesis 1, where it says how God created male and female. And what does that mean? And what do people say who are using it to interpret the kinds of things that we talk about here on this podcast?
You might be asking yourself, well, why are we talking about this? We're a secular podcast. We're talking about LGBTQ plus issues specifically in relationships. If there is a family that this is tearing up, oftentimes faith is one of the things that does that. And so for this episode, whether you are a person of faith or you're in conversation with a person of faith, or you just encounter this every now and then, this is an important issue that comes up frequently. And we have discovered that for our podcast, anytime we talk about LGBTQ plus issues and faith, those are some of the episodes that people are most interested in. I think because it's the hardest to get past. I know for me, it took me 2 decades of wrestling with my beliefs and with the Bible to figure out how even can I be affirming. I wanted to be affirming, but I kind of figured, well, the Bible says what the Bible says, and there's not really any way around that. It took me a lot of wrestling with things and a lot of taking arguments from the scholars seriously till I got to the point of kind of understanding. And that's what we want to do here right now. So our real goal with both this episode as well as for the podcast as a whole is to bring facts and especially to find peace. What we want to do is take the rhetoric and try to turn it down. There is so much hatred. There's so many places for us to break our relationships and for things to be difficult. We just want to find ways that we can strengthen our relationships, especially when somebody is having a real difficult time because of their faith. And Genesis 1 is one of those places that I hear come up pretty frequently.
Well, one of the things that concerns me is that a lot of people have been very hurt by the church that they're in because of situations like this. And it becomes so difficult for them that they say, well, these are the people I've been following and they must be right. Therefore, they reject God because they can't do something else. They are what they are.
I want to talk about what we're not addressing. We are not going to talk about trans issues in general. And so the hot button issues in the culture right now are going to be things like, should transgender people, particularly pre-operational transgender women, be allowed in locker rooms? Should transgender women high school or transgender girls in high school be allowed to play high school sports? Should transgender women be allowed to compete in the Olympics? Those are important questions, and they are not things that we're talking about here. So you can believe whatever you want to on those things, and that's not what we're talking about. What we're looking for is to find a place of acceptance for people like me. I am transgender. I came out about 10 years ago when I transitioned. I am in my early 50s now. So I spent the better part of my life living my life navigating society as a man, and then I transitioned, and now I work as a phone salesperson, and I'm on the phone all day long talking to people, and they recognize me. In general, they recognize my voice as a woman's voice, and they interact with me as a woman. This is a social category. And that's really what we're talking about is, can you, as a person of faith, accept someone like me? Can you say, Raya is a woman? Can you call me she in good faith? Or are you rejecting God by accepting who I say that I am and how I navigate the world culturally?
Well, one thing interesting about that, as you say, if they didn't know you before and they met you for the first time, they wouldn't have any idea that you used to be a man.
It would be pretty strange for somebody to meet me and to think to call me he,
Yeah,
it would be pretty awkward.
exactly.
And like if you saw me in a restaurant and you pointed me out and you wanted to say, get my attention, or you wanted the waiter or the waitress to recognize who I was, it would be very strange to point to me and to say he, because they would have no idea who you're talking
Exactly.
about.
If I saw you in a restaurant and I saw you over there, I'd say, "Oh, ma'am, could you get me another cup of coffee?"
Right. And that's the same how I'm treated when I speak with somebody on the phone. When they call into my company, generally people will say, "Yes, ma'am." I very rarely have somebody say yes, sir. Maybe once a month. It's very, very rare. Probably less frequently than you do when you get a call from somebody. So,
Yeah.
and that happens really to anybody. If your voice is not super high or not super low, that can happen to anybody.
They not often, but occasionally people will call me and not talked to me before and not knowing who I am. They'll say, "Hello, Mrs. Jones."
Yeah. And that kind of thing happens to anybody. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my background here. I did go to seminary. Now, I didn't graduate from seminary because I was still actually in my seminary career. I completed about 2/3 of my seminary degree before I transitioned. And then I did actually go back and try again after my transition. But by that point, my life situation had changed. So I've completed about 2/3 of my seminary degree. That means that I've done all of my Greek. I've done all of my Hebrew, so I can go back and read the Bible in its original languages, although I have to struggle through it and I use a lot of my online tools and things, but I can go back to those things.
Well, I'm glad you can do that because as far as I'm concerned, it's all Greek to me.
Yeah, right. So the idea here, I'm not trying to advance any new ideas. I am not a scholar in these categories by any means, but I am very interested in what the scholars do say. So the idea here is just for us to be echoing what the scholars say. I want to say one thing that I have is I have a deep, deep respect for the text of the Bible. And I think that we all should. Anybody that respects the Bible and thinks that the Bible is an important book, whether or not you believe it is the Word of God or you believe it's an important cultural artifact, I think we all should have a healthy respect for the Bible itself and for the words that are preserved in the Bible. And what that means is I refuse to intentionally twist it to fit my agenda. And I have felt that way no matter what my agenda has been. When I was a part of the conservative church, there was a strong push. Anytime you had two passages that didn't seem like they would line up with one another, to twist one of them to get it to line up with what the other one said. And I learned very early on that that's really disrespectful to the texts themselves. The actual book that we have, when you open up the Bible, you'll see there's 66 different books that are in there, written by a number of different authors, and they were written in ways that if you have a very high regard for the text, you believe that overall it is communicating the same message. But that doesn't mean that all of the authors were saying the same things. And there are certainly some places where you can find at least superficial contradictions between the two. And what I want to say is anytime you're looking at a specific passage, you want to listen very closely to what the passage itself is saying, rather than trying to take it and say, well, I need the passage to say this. And so you twist it to make it fit your agenda. I will always be opposed to that, whether the agenda that we're asserting is a conservative agenda or a liberal agenda or anything else entirely. Let the text speak for itself. One of my favorite academic books is called The New Testament and the People of God. It was written by N.T. Wright, a scholar of the New Testament, and he observed that the Bible has become really like contested terrain, where you've got all of these different groups setting up their fortifications without caring for the landscape itself. He said, this book is a book of wisdom for all peoples, but you have made it into a den of scholarship or of a narrow, hard, and exclusive piety. And of course, that's echoing one of the verses from other places in the Bible where Jesus says, my house was to be called a house of prayer, but you've made it into a den of thieves.
Yeah.
I think that he's right, that as we approach the Bible, as we approach these texts that are ancient. This text from Genesis goes back thousands of years. This was old when Jesus was reading this. This was already old for him. So for us to come back, I mean, it felt as old for him as it feels for us right now. As we approach these, we don't want to take these ancient stories and then try to shove them into our mold right now. They have to line up scientifically and do all the things that we're trying to do with them right now.
But isn't that what people do? I mean, that's what creates different denominations. That's what creates different religions, because they take them and they say, no, you're wrong about that. I think this is what it means.
Sure. And I do think, especially in our modern landscape right now, with the way that churches have multiplied and multiplied, what you really have, it's oftentimes like going from one family to another. Well, which family is right? Okay, well, in our family, you walk into the house and you take off your shoes. But in another family, you walk into the house and you leave your shoes on. In fact, it's strange if you're in the house without shoes. Which one is right?
Well, I can tell you, it doesn't matter, but I'll tell you, that is the thing that really describes exactly what a family is, because there is no business like shoe business.
Yeah, that's right. So N.T. Wright says, the problems that arise when these different approaches are juxtaposed are often focused on to one particular point, namely the tension between a reading that seeks to be, in some sense, normatively Christian and that which seeks to be faithful to history. And so then he comes to this and he says, I'm a historian. I want to use both. He says much of Christianity is afraid of history, frightened that if we really find out what happened in the first century, or in this case, when we're talking about Genesis, we really find out what happened back when these stories were first being told, our faith will collapse. But without historical inquiry, there is no check on Christianity's propensity to remake Jesus, never mind the Christian God in its own image. And in this case, we could say these texts themselves in these stories. It's easy to try to push these and to say something that it's not saying. We want to treat these texts with respect, no matter what your beliefs are. I just would ask you, listen to what the actual text itself is saying. So we're looking at Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 specifically. And Dad, I wonder if you would go ahead and read this for us.
Right. The version that I normally use, I have in my hand here now. And this is the New International Version, we usually call NIV. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Now, some people will say, well, you're just reading it. It's a translation of a translation of a translation. No, it's not. I have a copy of the Hebrew Bible. We can actually go and see what it says. Now, there are years at the beginning where there are scribal errors and scribes are copying this over. So there certainly is that. But on this passage in particular, what it's saying here in this verse is probably what it originally said when they were first compiling the text. If it's not, it's very, very close. The first thing there, when it's talking about, so God created mankind, and I usually will use the New Revised Standard Version, which translates it as humankind instead of mankind. But the idea here, the word in Hebrew, you know this word already. It's Adam, or to where we get the word Adam from, or the name Adam. Adam just means human. We sometimes will say, I think in the King James it says, so God created man in his image. But the word is not in that point gendered. It's just saying God created a human in his image, right? And then it goes on to say, in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them.
Right.
So what do people say about this text? Well, the people that are anti-LGBTQ plus issues, people that say that it's wrong to be transgender, that people that are non-binary are walking against God, the people that say, I don't participate in all this pronoun thing, what do they say about this text? Because this is oftentimes one of the very first ones that they'll come back to. Well, you'll hear things like, well, you can see here, God created them male and female, and so that's how it is. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Okay, so this is God's design. Transgender people are seen as rejecting how God made them. Non-binary people are seen as denying God's clear categories. There's man, there's woman, and who are you with this they, them? What is that all going on? The emotional force is that God doesn't make mistakes. He made you exactly the way that you are. And when you transitioned, Raya, you gave up who God made you to be, and you embraced a lie. Now, Dad, you and I take this seriously. This is what a lot of people genuinely believe, including people that I would consider friends.
Yes.
I understand why you feel this way. I hope as we speak to this that we're speaking to who you really are and what you're really bringing to this. I don't ever want to paint you as, well, look at the stupid thing that somebody believes. Because if I did, I'd be painting myself as stupid because that's where I was for 20 years.
How are we going to respond to that, Raya? Well, we'll hear about that right after the break.
Hi, I'm Andy Barrett, a Lutheran pastor and a supporter of this podcast. I see Transcendent as a ministry. I've pointed many people toward these recorded conversations full of so much heart and care and warmth, as well as some of Joe's jokes, which are hands down the worst part of this podcast. But even they make me smile. I'm one of the many genuinely blessed by Transcendent, and I encourage you to join me in supporting this podcast by giving as little as $3 a month. Go to transcendent.com and click support.
Okay, so that's a pretty difficult argument. How do we approach this verse? What do scholars say about this? Okay, I went and looked in one of my study Bibles that I had to read for one of my classes, the Jewish Study Bible. And it defines a figure of speech called a merism. That's M-E-R-I-S-M, or merism. It says it's a figure of speech in which opposing terms, for example, good and bad, are combined to convey the idea of including both terms and everything in between. So, for instance, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, therefore may mean the tree of the knowledge of everything. Merism is a figure of speech. It's like an exaggeration. And it's when you take two different things and you use it to represent everything in between. So you might say rich and poor. You might say both high and low, and what you really mean is not only the high parts and only the low parts. You mean everything in between. We talk about come young and old. We don't mean, well, you're 35, you're not allowed here. We mean young and old and everybody in between. Here's one that you'll appreciate, Dad. This is one that's more from modern English. It's not quite a merism because it's three of them, but how about I gave all my blood, sweat, and tears?
Oh, of course. They were my favorite rock group.
I know that they were. How about when we talk about they take everything in the kitchen sink?
Yes.
Okay, well, we don't really mean that they took the kitchen sink. It's a figure of speech, and that's exactly what's going on here. They talk about day and night, and that doesn't mean that all that there is in the day was there was noon and there was midnight and nothing in between. When they talk about day and night in Genesis chapter 1, they're talking about noon and 3 in the afternoon and 9 o'clock in the evening, 3 a.m. and 9 a.m. The whole part of the day is included. You don't think, well, we're not talking about dusk. We're not talking about twilight because we only said day and night.
There's that gray area in there. It's not yet dark, and yet the sun has really set, and you're just getting a little bit of light. And where are we at? Or it's just coming up. Well, it's not really daylight yet, but it's not night anymore either. I mean, I can see across the street.
And so what scholars are arguing now, scholars that are LGBTQ plus affirming, is that male and female works exactly the same way. Why would we apply a rigid binary only to gender, right? Why do we talk about day and night, but then we don't talk about the spectrum of gender? The idea is that there is a lot more. And this is not just new scholars. The original Hebrew scholars that created the Talmud, which was a theological text that was used among the Jewish community to interpret the Old Testament scriptures or the Hebrew Bible scriptures recognized that there were more than two categories, more than just male and female. They did have male, they did have female, but then they had four more. There was one that they called tum, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing these exactly correct, but I'm doing my best. That is somebody whose sex is hidden or ambiguous. They talked about somebody that was androgynous, I believe. That's coming from Greek. They're pulling that in. That's somebody that has both male and female characteristics. They talked about ailonite, which is somebody who's assigned female at birth but develops male characteristics. And they talked about somebody that is saris, I think I'm saying that correctly. Somebody that is assigned male at birth but develops female characteristics. Or also then somebody that's considered a eunuch would fall into that category.
So that was known back a long time ago.
Yes,
It
absolutely.
wasn't something that was created in the 20th century or the 19th century. That concept was known a long time.
And in fact, in probably the 19th century and in the early 20th century is when we actually made this much more problematic because we had grown a lot more in our scientific procedures. And then when somebody was born with ambiguous genitalia, now that we had these new surgery procedures, they said, well, we need to correct that. We need to fix that. And we have now since discovered that for the babies that are born with ambiguous genitalia, you are much better off to let things go and let them grow old so you can find out, how they actually identify. Don't just pick one or the other. Can you imagine if when you were born, if you had any ambiguous genitalia and they said, this must be a girl. And so then you grew up thinking I'm supposed to be a girl. And then, but for some reason, this doesn't fit.
You're talking here about mostly the Judeo-Christian belief. But if you look at other cultures, say, for example, the indigenous people of North America, the indigenous people of North America recognized what they called two-spirit people. Two-spirit people being those who are either gay or lesbian, and that was something that actually was to be honored and not just accepted, but considered blessed.
We see that all throughout the cultures of the world.
Yes.
Anthropologists have observed this in lots of different societies, absolutely. And so you see a spectrum both at the physical level, and we would call those people intersex people. And we can talk a little bit about that. That's kind of what I was describing here, that there are people born with XXY chromosomes, or there's people born with ambiguous genitalia, hormone variations, but neither of us are intersex, and we're not aware of anybody in our social circles that are intersex, although statistically we probably do know somebody, they just haven't come out to us. So there's a spectrum physically, but then there's also a spectrum socially, and that's where I would fit. As far as I'm aware, I have XY chromosomes. I fit in just well when I was presenting male, but I got to a point in my life where I realized this doesn't feel like me. And not only does it not feel like me, but I can't go on living this way any longer. This is miserable. I am absolutely miserable. I was a black cloud that whole time, and so I transitioned. What we're talking about here, there's a whole spectrum. And so for the people that say, well, male and female, he created them, and so God made you a man, and that's how you are, you're missing lots of nuance here. Just like somebody that says, well, God created day and night, and therefore there's noon, and there's midnight, and there's nothing in between. But that's not really fair to the world that we observe, that has dusk, that has twilight, that has, it's always darkest before the dawn. There's lots of different times that we go through in the day, and there are lots of different genders. There are lots of different varieties of sexual expression between male and female. And if you just try to jam it into these two harsh categories, you lose a lot of the nuance, and you erase a whole group of people that say, hey, wait a minute, we exist.
We're talking about a spectrum here, and the other people who will disavow that, they end up saying, okay, that's just the way it is. Here they are. There's male and female, and that's it. Well, clearly, if they do that, they are excluding many people. As a matter of fact, percentage-wise, probably 10%.
Yeah, not necessarily transgender.
No.
But when we talk about all the LGBTQ plus people,
Yes.
yes, absolutely. And especially if you consider the people that are bisexual but are straight passing, it's probably even larger than that.
Right. And
Yeah.
therefore, it is human reality. It is what we are. And it also is what we are when you look back in history and have been for thousands of years.
The Bible uses the term, sitting at your right hand. And that means that that Jesus is the right hand man of the Father, right? Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. But if you assume that the only important people can ever sit at the right hand, you're excluding all left-handers. And Dad is, of course, left-handed, as he likes to remind us. If you assume that, we all understand, those of us that are right-handed, we understand what that means. But if you assume that, left-handers are all written out of everything, you're taking a huge group of people and you're basically saying, sorry, you have no place.
Yes, we're not going to make any scissors for you.
And you have experienced that, I'm sure, many times.
I have. As a matter of fact, just this last week. I
Really?
had
just
a hard
again.
time.
Oh, no.
No kidding. I really did.
Oh,
Yeah.
no. And so it all comes back to the most important thing. If you are a Christian, and that's, of course, the tradition that we come from, it comes back to Jesus. And Jesus said, it all comes down to this: love your neighbor as yourself and love God above all else. If you do those two things, you got it down pretty well. This is where you need to go. So when you find yourself coming to the place where you're elevating your interpretation of something that marginalizes other people, belittles other people, that's not hurting somebody, really, you need to stop and ask yourself, are you walking in love? Or are you twisting the Bible to mean something that it doesn't mean, but supports your traditional interpretation? Because think about it, in the antebellum South, a lot of people did exactly that to justify slavery.
Yes.
And once we all came around and recognized slavery is inhumane, now none of us thinks that the Bible supports that. But yet, I could very easily point out a dozen verses to you that all seem to support that slavery is okay. Not only is it okay, but it's God's plan. And yet we recognize it is never okay to own another human being.
Exactly.
And all we're saying here is that when it comes to LGBTQ plus issues, we're on the exact same field. That the way that things have been interpreted traditionally, when I say traditionally, I mean in the 19th and 20th centuries, doesn't mean that that's the right way to do it. And if it was inhumane, then it's inhumane now.
I agree.
A quick word to those who are in unaffirming churches. A lot of people, you find your community there. This is a church that says it's wrong to be gay, to be lesbian, to be transgender. What we'll oftentimes hear is everybody is welcome here. But they keep they don't say the quiet parts out loud, which is, yes, you're welcome here, but you can't act like that. You can't bring your gay partner with you. You can't be supported as a transgender person. Sure, I'm welcome in a conservative church, but I can't go to the women's retreat. In a church like that, I don't think that you should have to feel like you have to leave. But also, if you've got an LGBTQ plus loved one and you're trying to figure out how to reconcile all this together, you may find that it's not the right place for you. And it's time to rethink, is there a better community for you?
On that note, the good news is there are many more churches that are continuing to be affirming. They are growing. The number of churches that are doing that in the U.S. are growing dramatically, and also in some of the other countries as well. That is starting to move in that direction more frequently every year. So we're on the right track, but will you see it as total acceptance, probably not in our lifetime.
And, there is a place to be, a place said for staying in those churches as well.
Yes.
If you are at a place where you feel confident on LGBTQ plus issues, boy, do we need you in those environments. And Dad, you and Mom go to one of those when you're traveling.
Yes, we do.
That's your home church when you're home away from home.
Yes, we have a lot of friends there. We get along with the pastor very well. We enjoy the service, and we feel as though many ways we are connecting with God. But I've always said, if I'm going to try to find a church where I have no disagreements, I'm going to be the only member.
And so we can see a case made either way, and you really have to consider that for yourself and what makes the most sense for you and especially for your family. Because keep in mind, this is about preserving relationships. And what's most important at the end of our life is not that, I stuck it out in a church that was really difficult for me and I made it through to the end, although I lost the people that were most important to me. None of us wants to say that. And so figure it out for yourself of what makes the most sense for you. And it's not an easy decision to make.
That is a hard decision to make. But what's not a hard decision to make is coming back to this podcast every Monday.
We're grateful to have you here week after week as we try to bring a message of positivity to you to improve your relationships. And if you know somebody that might benefit from listening to this podcast, if you would share this podcast with them, that really means a lot to them and it means a lot to us.
And you can tell them, we'll see you Monday.
We'll see you Monday.